Good evening and welcome. Tonight we are going to be reading more out of this book, the Encyclopedia of American Indian History and Culture. Tonight we're going to be reading about tribes from the Southeast. So let's just dive right in. We will be starting off, make sure this is the first one. We'll be starting off with the Biloxi tribe. Get my pencil. Biloxi, here we go. With the name thought to mean first people, the Biloxi tribe originally lived on lands along the coast of the Gulf of Mexico. The mighty Mississippi River flowed through their land, making it very fertile, and the Biloxi were settled farming people. They also hunted bear, deer, and buffalo, and food was usually plentiful year-round. Like many of the tribes in the southeast, the Biloxi practiced river cane crafts. Women harvested local plants, including the river cane, a type of bamboo, which they wove into rattles, baskets, and vessels for storing and carrying food. The tribe's population was small, and although it had avoided contact with Europeans for many years, interactions with other tribes brought European diseases into the Biloxi villages. Smallpox, measles, whooping cough, and others. There we go. Their population decreased rapidly. The tribe moved westward to avoid conflicts with other tribes and European settlers, especially the British. When the French and Indian War ended in 1763, the British gained control of much of North America, including Biloxi lands east of the Mississippi River. By the late 1700s, the Biloxi had moved west into territory controlled by the Spanish. They established small settlements there. In the 1780s, Spanish colonist Bernardo Vicente Apolinar de Galvez reserved some land for another tribe with a decreasing population, the Tunica, near Marksville, Louisiana. Further weakened by disease, the Biloxi felt vulnerable and decided to join the Tunica there. Although the two tribes spoke different languages and had different cultures, the Biloxi believed that there was safety in numbers. Over time, the two tribes intermarried, and the Biloxi language began to fade out of use. In the 1920s, the two tribes united to pursue land rights and tribal status from the U.S. government. Louisiana granted state recognition to the Tunica Biloxi Indian tribe in 1976, and the tribe received federal recognition later in 1981. And next we have the Catawba. There we go, the whole page. The Catawba are the only federally recognized tribe in South Carolina. Living on a 1,000-acre reservation today, they once inhabited a number of villages in North and South Carolina, most of them in river valleys. The tribe calls itself Iswa, which means people of the river. Families lived in round bark homes and gathered in another, more elaborate structure for religious ceremonies. A wooden palisade or fence surrounded the village, and at its center lay an open plaza where members gathered to play games or to dance. The tribe grew crops of corn, squash, beans, and sunflowers. Visitors to the Catawba Reservation can see an old native garden planted in the traditional way. The tribe was known for its fine pottery. They fashioned round pots using stacks of coiled clay, which they smoothed over for a flat surface. Tribal people still make pots in this way. Other tribes regarded the Catawba as fearsome. They fought often with the Iroquois and Cherokee. To prepare for battle, they wore ponytails and painted their faces with striking black and white designs. In the mid-1600s, English settlers moved into Catawba territory. Villages became trading hubs, and the tribe exchanged deerskins, baskets, and pottery for knives, kettles, and cloth with the Europeans. The tribe allied with the English against the Spanish and French, but the English did not return this loyalty. Later that century, English traders captured Catawba women and children and sold them as slaves, and they killed many men. By 1760, the Catawba numbered just 400 people. In the same year, the Pine Tree Hill Treaty, made with the British, confined the Catawba to a 15-square-mile reservation near the Catawba River. In 1840, the state of South Carolina failed to honor the Pine Tree Hill Treaty and took the Catawba land. Over the next century, many tribal members moved away and joined other cultures. The U.S. government's termination policy of the 1950s led to the tribe's loss of tribal status and land rights in 1959. That same year, the last Catawba speaker died, and the language faded out. In 1973, the tribe challenged the government's policy, and following a 20-year struggle, Congress restored the Catawba status and awarded the tribe a $50 million land claim. And next is Cherokee. The Cherokee are one of the largest tribes living in North America today. The first written mention of the tribe is by the Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto, who encountered the Cherokee in 1540. At that time, the tribe commanded a vast area of the southeast. They spread across present-day Virginia to northern Georgia and into eastern Tennessee. There we go. The Cherokee name comes from a Choctaw word meaning cave people, but the tribal members call themselves Aniwunya, which means real people. Before Europeans arrived, the Cherokee lived in almost 70 large, well-organized riverside communities, in which they built thatched cabins from logs. They planted crops of corn, squash, and beans, and hunted deer, sometimes dressing in deer skins and antlers to help lure the animals. Among the crafts the Cherokee made were booger masks. Carved from wood and painted, they represented powerful spirits. When English settlers began moving in, the tribe's strength was first tested by disease. In 1738 and 1739, it suffered a smallpox epidemic that cut its population in half. The tribe initially fought against the settlers, but later made peace with them. They signed treaties, and the tribe became one of the 5 civilized tribes that adopted English ideas and customs. By the 19th century, the tribe still controlled a large area of land, but the U.S. government wanted it. From 1838 to 1839, U.S. troops forced 16,000 Cherokee to move to Oklahoma. About 4,000 people died on the long trek, which became known as the Trail of Tears. Those who survived the walk made a new life in Oklahoma. Within just 1 year of arriving, they had reestablished their government and had to set to work constructing their Capitol building. Today, there are 2 federally recognized groups in the state, the Cherokee Nation and the Kituwa Band, both with headquarters in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. A third tribe of federally recognized Cherokee, the Eastern Band, has its base in the Qualla Boundary Territory of North Carolina. And next we have, move this right there so you can see it all, the Chitimacha. Louisiana is the ancestral home of the Chitimacha. According to historical evidence, the tribe has lived in this area of the southeast for 6,000 years, inhabiting 15 large villages around the Mississippi Delta. The tribe followed a clan system in which membership was passed on through the mother. The clans were wolf, bear, dog, and lion. The warm climate and fertile soil in Louisiana was good for farming corn, pumpkins, sweet potatoes, and other crops. Tribesmen also hunted deer and alligator and fished in the many rivers. Women made baskets from river cane, which they dyed red, black, and yellow using plant dyes. Along with the natural color of the cane, this gave them 4 colors with which to weave as many as 50 different patterns and motifs into their designs. They made bowls, trays, and seed sifters, as well as elbow baskets, which they used for picking berries. By the 1700s, the French had established colonies in Louisiana. During their time there, they took Chitimacha people as slaves. The tribe rebelled against the French in the early 1700s and killed 4 Frenchmen, including a missionary and a slave owner. The French sought revenge and convinced their allies, among them the Biloxi and Choctaw, to join them in war against the Chitimacha. For 12 years, the Chitimacha fought for their freedom, but they lost many warriors. Of those who survived, most ended up captured and sold into slavery. By 1718, the tribal population had few members left. An increasing number of Chitimacha people married white settlers, and lost much of their language, culture, and traditions. At its lowest, the tribal population numbered 51 people. By the 1900s, the Chitimacha owned very little land. Then a wealthy white woman named Sarah Avery McElhenney helped to change that. A friend of the tribe, her family had made its fortune producing Tabasco sauce. In 1914, she bought 400 acres of the tribe's ancestral lands and sold them to the U.S. government. The understanding was that the government would now allow the tribe to use this land as a reservation, which they did. 2 years later, the federal government formally recognized the Chitimacha tribe as well. Today, the tribe numbers about 1,300 people. They rent out some of their reservation land for oil mining, but also depend on agriculture and other tribal-run industries. And next is the Choctaw. According to Choctaw history, the tribe began at Nanawaya, a sacred mound in Mississippi. The state controlled the site for many years, but returned it to the tribe in 2006. The Choctaw have lived in parts of what is now Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama for thousands of years. They are descended from the area's mound-building cultures. Living in villages around the lower Mississippi River, the Choctaw were primarily farmers. Their lives revolved around the seasons for planting and harvesting crops of corn, beans, squash, melons, and sunflowers. While many Southeastern tribal men shaved their heads, the Choctaw men wore their hair long. Like other Southeastern tribes, the Choctaw played stickball. Village teams played against each other, sometimes in tournaments involving up to 700 players. By the 1600s, the large Choctaw tribe had divided into 3 groups, each with its own government and chief. All 3 actively traded with the French and later with the British. They supported the British during the Revolutionary War, but signed a peace treaty with the new U.S. government in 1786 at Hopewell, South Carolina. In the War of 1812, the Choctaw remained loyal to the new nation, fighting alongside U.S. troops against the British. Like the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole, the Choctaw were one of the 5 civilized tribes that adopted a European way of life. In 1820, the U.S. government forced its takeover of Choctaw land. By the early 1830s, the Choctaw had ceded almost 11 million acres. Most tribal members moved to lands west of the Mississippi River. Many made the horrific trip on the Trail of Tears to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma, with more than 2,500 dying on the way. In 1918, the U.S. government forced the few who remained in Mississippi onto a reservation. Today, both the Mississippi Band of Choctaw and the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma practice their ancestral traditions and own and manage a number of successful businesses. And next is the Kushata. Living as widely spread as Louisiana, Texas, and Oklahoma today, the Kushata have a vibrant culture featuring traditional ceremonies, arts, and language. Tribal artists produce baskets from long coiled pine needles and woven cane, using techniques for which the tribe has long been known. Dancers perform at powwows and compete against each other in such dances as the women's fancy shawl dance and the men's grass dance. The tribe has also made great efforts to keep its language alive. Many members speak Coasati, the language of their ancestors, as it was spoken centuries before. The tribe's ancestral home was in northern Alabama, where people lived in towns near the Tennessee River and farmed corn, among other crops. They also hunted and fished and traded with other southeastern tribes. Sometime before the 1500s, the Kushata moved farther south in Alabama and into Georgia. By the mid-1700s, the tribe was part of the Creek Confederacy, which included the Creek and the Alabama. After the Revolutionary War, the Kushata began to lose their lands to the U.S. government. In 1783, the tribe signed a treaty in which they ceded over 800 square miles of land in Georgia. They were forced to move again. The tribe then spread west into Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, and after the Creek War in 1813, a group of Kushata settled in Oklahoma. Although the U.S. government terminated their tribal status in 1953, The Kushata regained federal recognition in 1973. Today they run a rice farm, a woodworking business, and other industries. In Texas, the Kushata share a reservation with the Alabama, on which they control the forestry and gas industries. Descendants of the Southeastern Kushata also formed an alliance with the Alabama tribe in Oklahoma, and together they founded the federally recognized Alabama Kushata Tribal Town Tribe. And next we have the Creek. Okay, here we go. The Creek, also known as the Muskogee, are descendants of the Mississippian mound builders who occupied a large area of flatland territory in what are now the states of Georgia and Alabama. The English first used the name Creek in relation to the people who lived near their trading post of Cheesy Creek in present-day South Carolina. The tribe's main towns in Georgia and Alabama were Coosa, Casita, Coweta, and Abika, though there were many more smaller communities of the Creek tribe across the whole region. Each town was distinct, with its own Miko or chief, but they each supported one another, especially in times of war. The tribe's living came mostly from farming, and crops included the three staples of corn, beans, and squash. Typically, the women farmed the land while the men went out to hunt. Within their villages, the Creek built rectangular houses with pitched bark or thatched roofs. The walls were constructed from poles that were then covered with mud to form plaster. The houses were built around a plaza in which people gathered to take part in ceremonies such as the Midsummer Green Corn Ceremony, celebrating the fruits of that year's harvest. The tribe roughly divided into upper or northern and lower or southern Creek groups. Many tribal members died from the diseases introduced by the Europeans, but those who remained formed in the Creek Confederacy in the mid-1500s. As the English, Spanish, and French battled for control over the southeast, the Creeks tried to avoid conflict. They were more interested in protecting their profits from trading in slaves and deerskins with the English. Many thousands of deerskins exchanged hands every year. After the Revolutionary War, the Creek became one of the 5 civilized tribes associated with George Washington's program to enforce European ways of life on the southeastern tribes. Most Creeks were open to the proposed ideas and adopted several of them, such as farming techniques, schooling their children, and housing. A Creek civil war erupted during the War of 1812. The Upper Creeks were known as the Red Sticks. They joined the Shawnee chief Tecumseh in his support for the British. Ultimately, Tecumseh and the tribes fighting alongside him wanted to stop the U.S. government from taking over tribal lands. The Lower Creeks, known as the White Sticks, fought with U.S. troops to crush the Red Sticks. They ultimately succeeded at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814. Following their defeat, the surviving Red Sticks joined the Seminole in Florida. During the next 20 years, the Creek ceded much of the vast lands and treaties. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 forced most remaining Creek to move to Oklahoma. Today there are 4 federally recognized Creek groups in the state. The largest is the Creek Nation in Okmulgee. The Porch Band of Creek Indians is a small band in Alabama. Next we have the Mikasuki. The Mikasuki tribe formed when a number of Creeks relocated to Spanish territory in Florida in the early 1700s. They settled in the Appalachia Bay area south of present-day Tallahassee, where they farmed the land, growing corn and other crops. You can see all of it there. It was not long before the tribe felt threatened by settlers and slave traders. To avoid conflict, they moved farther east and south. Even so, the tribe could not escape war altogether. Mikasuki warriors supported the Seminole in their rebellion against the U.S. government from 1817 to 1858. In 1819, Spain sold Florida to the United States, and it became a U.S. territory 3 years later. The U.S. government wanted the land and forced the Mikasuki and the Seminole to sign the Treaty of Moultrie. The treaty assigned a reservation in Central Florida in return for all the remaining tribal land. During the 1830s, a number of Mikasuki avoided relocation under the Indian Removal Act by hiding in the Everglades. They built chickee houses here in order to cope with the swamp-like territory. These houses were platforms raised up on poles. They had open sides and palmetto thatched roofs. Growing traditional crops such as corn was difficult, but the Mikasuki found ways to survive in this new environment. They learned to hunt and fish in the Everglades, which they knew as, kahayatl, a word that describes its shimmering water. By the mid-1900s, Everglades National Park engulfed most of the Mikasuki lands. The Tamiami Trail Highway, constructed in 1928, damaged the natural ecosystem, reducing fish and game populations. In spite of these difficulties, the Mikasuki fought for tribal status and for the land they had been living on. The U.S. government recognized the Mikasuki tribe in 1962. The tribe continues to live in the Everglades, preserving its culture and protecting the land. And next we have the Seminole. Okay, there. The Seminole are descendants of tribal peoples, most of whom were Creeks who migrated from Florida to Georgia and Alabama in the 1700s and early 1800s. Although they spoke different languages and lived in independent towns, all of Florida native peoples became known as Seminoles. The name probably comes from the Spanish word cimarron, which means wild or runaway. But a more appropriate interpretation may be free. The Seminole lived in villages built on swampland and raised their houses on platforms to keep them dry, their open sides allowing the inhabitants to stay cool in summer. When the Creeks arrived, they brought their farming traditions with them, although crop growing was less successful in this territory. Men fished the waterways from dugout canoes, spearing fish and alligators. Before the Creek Civil War of 1813 to 1814, the Seminole had been a small group. Afterward, the tribe's population grew to about 5,000. Living with the Seminole were many runaway slaves known as Black Seminoles. After defeating the Red Sticks, or the Upper Creeks, at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814, U.S. General Andrew Jackson led his troops to Florida to reclaim runaway slaves, burning Seminole villages and seizing Spanish towns in the process. The tribe succeeded in fighting back in what became known as the First Seminole War, but their victory was short-lived. After Spain ceded Florida to the United States, the Americans forced the Seminoles onto a reservation in central Florida. Then in 1835, the U.S. government tried to relocate the Seminole to Oklahoma. Many refused to go, sparking the Second Seminole War, which lasted from 1835 until 1842. A Third Seminole War followed, from 1855 to 1858. Many Seminole eventually relocated to Oklahoma, but a small group, 200 or so, avoided relocation by hiding in the Everglades. Today they are the Seminoles of Florida. Having built on their agricultural past, they now run businesses that include citrus and cattle farms. Next we have the Tunica. Like their allies, the Biloxi, the Tunica are descendants of the ancient mound builders. Today, the two tribes share a reservation near present-day Marksville, Louisiana, and are united under a federally recognized name, the Tunica Biloxi. The early Tunica people lived in large villages in northern Mississippi and Arkansas, with their capital at Quizquiz. When Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto first met them there in 1541, the Tunica were a large, powerful tribe. By the early 1700s, due to the spread of European diseases, the Tunica had dwindled in numbers and were less able to defend themselves against the Natchez tribe, with whom they had a history of conflict. In order to survive, the Tunica allied themselves with the French and fought with the Europeans in battles against the Natchez. The French and Tunica became firm trading partners, particularly in salt and horses. Even before European arrival, the tribe controlled the salt trade in the area and continued to hold that control. After the French and Indian War, the Tunica moved into present-day Louisiana. At the time, the Spanish controlled the area and in the 1780s created a reservation for the tribe. The Biloxi joined the tribe, and together they fought for rights and recognition. The Tunica culture remained vibrant. but by the mid-1900s, few tribe members spoke their native language. Since 2010, the Tunica have been working with Tulane University on the Tunica Language Project, an initiative working to help restore and keep the ancestral language alive through children's books, recordings, camps, and many other projects. And that's the end for the night. That was a quick one, but I believe all the rest are much, much, much longer. I'll get to those someday. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video relaxing and educational. And I hope that you have a very good